We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Okay, welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch. My name is Jonathan Paquin, professeur de sciences politiques à l'Université Laval à Québec et responsable de l'axe de recherche sur les grandes...
I'm a professor at the Laval University in political science and focused on research on great powers. Welcome to the second panel of our colloquium focused on Afghanistan and the impact of the withdrawal of the American troops on that country and on NATO, as well as its impact on great powers.
The end of the war in Afghanistan on NATO. We have four great panelists, and I will turn the floor over to Brigadier General Richard Giguère, who will be the moderator of this second panel. The panel will end at 3:30. So thank you very much. Richard Giguère, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Professor Paquin, for giving me the opportunity to support our speakers in the framework of this conference. It is with great surprise that I looked at the images from the Kabul airport. I was actually flabbergasted looking at these in the summer, as described appropriately Ambassador Boswell earlier today. Canada invested a lot in Afghanistan in terms of funds, sweat, and blood. I personally served 2 missions in Afghanistan, the first in Kabul in 2004 and another mission of a 1-year duration in Kandahar in 2010 and 2011. As it is highly probable that the 40,000 Canadian military that served at one moment or another in this particular theater of operation wondered when seeing these images, what on earth happened? Once the surprise dissipated, by taking a step back, I think we come up with a true question to ask, which should be, but what on earth did not happen? I'm personally pursuing research that would allow me to find an answer, and this research path, it revolves around negative peace and positive peace. It seems to me that we've managed with our allies from NATO to create a climate of negative peace in Afghanistan. Obviously, there were tragic events, deadly combat, terrorist attacks, and all sorts of explosions using makeshift explosive devices, but never during our presence did we fear to lose Kabul or Kandahar at the hands of the Taliban. The Allied military forces that were present managed to create a relative safe bubble, but peace is much more than the absence of open combat. When guns stop firing and the physical safety is reduced, to instill safety, we need to make for the physical, moral safety of civilian populations. We need to foster cooperation rather than competition. We need to appease conflicts in an efficient legal framework. We need to provide for just and equitable or equal access to resources. The military forces deployed in theaters such as Afghanistan allow, in my opinion, most of us to set up a relatively safe environment that should allow for a true state and society transition that would lead to the instauration of a true and durable peace. The example of Afghanistan, an example among many others lately, it seems to me, seems to show that winning peace is much more difficult than winning the war. So it is a great pleasure for me to continue in this regard by welcoming 4 speakers. 4 speakers at this panel, and the topic is the impact of the end of the war in Afghanistan on NATO. So in the program or the agenda that was sent out, you've seen the complete bios of most of our speakers. Hani, if I may say a few extra words about you when it's your turn, I will do so. So without further ado, I will give the mic to Chiara Ruffa, who's an academic fellow at the Department of Research on Peace and Conflicts of the University of Uppsala in Sweden, as well as associate professor in war studies at the Swedish University of Defense. Chiara's research focused on military relations and state military forces in non-conventional conflicts. So, as we said earlier, our speakers have between 15 and 20 minutes to make their presentation, which should allow us to have enough time for the questions period at the end. So thank you very much, Chiara. The floor is yours. So hello, good afternoon or good evening. Thank you to Jonathan Paquin and Brigadier General Giguère for the invitation. I'm very happy for this invitation from the Network for Strategic Analysis and to be part of this presentation and conference. So as the Brigadier General said, my presentation will focus on what was the topic of my research in the previous years. That is the operational aspects of multinational operations, and I'm sure that my esteemed co-panelists will focus rather on the NATO aspect of things, and I will focus on NATO countries and external foreign operations, what could be the future of these foreign operations. So I will give my presentation in English, but I will be happy to answer any question you may have in French. And it's always a wonderful opportunity for me to practice my French a little.
It's such a pleasure and an honor to have the opportunity to speak to such a distinguished audience, and also with such great company with my co-panelist. So the objective of my presentation is to reflect upon what is the nature of NATO's expeditionary operation, how does it look like based on what we know now, and in which direction may this evolve. So I think that the background of this is characterized by 3 main factors, of course, contextual factors. So the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the 20-year operational experience there, of course. The second is, of course, what we are seeing this day, that is the evolution of the general security context with the US pivoting to Asia and the new security framework that Russia is pushing for since at least 2014. And then third, the current ongoing transformation in how state military organizations in NATO countries are put to use. So out-of-area operations are also known as, of course, expeditionary operation, really became the core of NATO's operational focus after the end of the Cold War. The operational focus, the expeditionary operational focus, was so important that there were several experts in the early 90s writing things like, if we do not go out of areas, we would go out of business. This was Hamilton Lugar, for instance, among many others, really reflecting on the need to become expeditionary. About 30 years later, several out-of-area missions have been deployed, notably the almost 20-year-long engagement in Afghanistan, but also just to mention many others, right? So Operation Active Endeavor, just after the 9/11 terrorist attacks that was aimed to deter, defend, and disrupt and protect against terrorist activity. In the Mediterranean, the NATO operation in Libya, enforcing among others the no-fly zone, Unified Protector, the Stabilization Force S4, but also very quick and very light footprinted operations like the intervention to help out at the time of the Pakistan earthquake relief assistance in 2005, 2006 with pretty spectacular airlifting, and also an operation during Hurricane Katrina, for instance. So there was really there was an establishing tradition to do expeditionary kinds of operations. So countries deployed and a plethora of different operations were conducting, ranging from humanitarian assistance to counterinsurgency to stabilizations, among many others. So the interesting things here, of course, so what we also would like to talk about today is has to do with the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and that was maybe the most, that is of course the most known sort of kind of expeditionary operation which we are talking about today, which was made of a plethora of nations. It evolved over time, as many of you have already mentioned in the first two panels today, ranging really starting with a stabilization approach with when ISAF started off, to the surge and the clear hold build approach, and then from 2015 when it became resolute support, really became a mission that was aimed at and helping out the reconstruction and reinforcement of and the creation of a professional set of security forces in Afghanistan. All of it seems to be drawing to an end, and NATO is, if we look at the current situation right now, NATO is really has really withdrawn after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as this is really involved in just a handful of operations, and of those, just really a few could probably be named expeditionary. So right now, it really seems that NATO is exiting the expeditionary focus. So as we are talking, we have the NATO mission in Iraq that can probably qualify as an out-of-area operation with several hundreds NATO trainers from several different NATO and also partner countries. And that mission is mostly really about doing non-combat training and capacity building. Then we have the NATO's role, still persistingly important role in Kosovo, with more than 3,000 allied and partner troops operations that are trying to create a professional multi-ethnic Kosovo security force. Operation Sea Guardian, which is at the that is tasked with maritime situational awareness, counterterrorism at sea, a very important cooperation with the African Union in support of the African Standby Force, and very important NATO air policing. So I would say that of these, probably what would qualify as expeditionary operation are really, strictly speaking, as we have been talking about them so far, is really only the NATO mission in Iraq and the cooperation with the African Union. So very, very small, pretty, with very light footprint and with a clearly non-combat focus. And most of the resources that NATO is putting into, from an operational point of view, has really put into this pivot towards Eastern Europe, and many NATO countries have really shifted, particularly on the eastern side, on the Eastern European side, towards national defense and a return to territorial defense. So, in this presentation, for the remainder of it, I would like to ask So what happened and what are we likely to see in the future, given that we clearly have a clear exiting, a clear drawdown of the expeditionary focus towards a much more with a where the expeditionary missions are just two, strictly speaking, and they are also non-combat focus and really focus on security as force assistance. So I would like to argue in the remainder of my presentation that there are maybe it may look like the obvious answer to this question, what is the future of out of area operation? Maybe, well, there is no future, right, to out of area expeditionary operations. But what we seem to see is instead a set of 4 distinct processes that may partly explain the different outlook, the different operational outlook that NATO seems to have today. And I much look forward to discussing and thinking through this together later in the Q&A. So these 4 processes that I identified, I'm trying to illustrate them through a set of examples. So the first process I think there is that we see in a lot of NATO countries, and I think that also our keynote speaker mentioned, is a certain degree of frustration with the the failure of the Afghanistan wars, as some have put it, and particularly the frustration with all the weaknesses that came with the Afghanistan intervention. So many NATO countries came to the realization at some point that this large-scale boots-on-the-ground operation was way too costly, very difficult to maintain, and ultimately unsuccessful. So we see a realization already in a lot of academic work. We see a realization in a lot of the interviews already in 2011-12 that several contributing countries were aware of the fact that things were not really working, and and that really then turned into the decision to then turn into a more light footprint kind of operation, with starting with Resolute support in 2015. So I think that what became clear to a lot of NATO countries is really the realization that working multinationally proved to be exceptionally challenging at the tactical, operational and strategic levels. So there was, as I think General Giguère already mentioned in his question to the keynote speaker, right, these different interpretations of different mandates, different casualty aversions, even in AOR with similar threats levels, and this is really work that I've done on the NATO mission in Afghanistan. There seemed to be completely different understanding of what the troops were supposed to do, and I studied particularly French and Italian troops deployed in the regional command capital, so in relatively similar areas, and clearly the French had a much clearer idea, that a distinct understanding of the mission as being one of counterinsurgency, while the Italian troops deployed in that area really understood this as peacekeeping. And what we seem to find in a lot of the work on multinational missions, right, is that this has been important also for military effectiveness and the actual ability of troops, of NATO troops, to achieve certain the stated and purposed objectives. So that was I think a big realization that partly explained the unwillingness to engage in other kinds of operation of this kind, even when it meant to stay on in Afghanistan with a larger amount of troops. And the other, I think, big realization that came was the fact that during the NATO mission, troop parts of ISAF have also struggled a lot to understand how to deal with the infamous winning hearts and minds approach. So this winning hearts and minds that actually had a tactical and a military objective often collided very strongly with the objective of several humanitarian organizations that saw the humanitarian space being militarized. That made their work really on a day-to-day basis extremely difficult, and I think it really affected very strongly the behavior and perception of a lot of those NATO troop contributing countries on the ground, even in areas that were a bit more permissive, like the Regional Command North or the Regional Command West. So I think these are important things to take into account when understanding why we see what we see today in terms of expeditionary operations. The second process I would like to mention has to do with a slow process of spread of the lessons of Afghanistan in more indirect ways. So I don't think that if we don't see the same kinds of large boots on the ground operations launched by NATO nowadays, it necessarily means that everything that has been learned during those 20 years in Afghanistan has been lost. To the contrary, I think we see a lot of really interesting sort of activities and also sort of force structures and innovations that are being exported to other kinds of mission. And I just want to share the screen to show you what I mean by that. So one interesting thing that has been happening, for instance, has been how so this was just a few pictures from. Yes. So, for instance, one interesting thing that happened has been the exporting ASIFU, that gray box that you see at the bottom. I think it's right of the screen. ASIFU, the All Sources Intelligence Information Fusion Unit, that has been exported, was a NATO invention and widely used in the ISAF times during the ISAF mission, widely used by a plethora of NATO and also partner countries. Sweden used it quite a lot as well, despite not being a NATO member. And that has been exported to what you have in front of you, which is the command structure of the United Nations multinational mission in Mali, MINUSMA. Just to give you an example of how this transfer has been, and how also the NATO mission in Afghanistan has not only been sort of an occasion to reflect upon failure, but also an opportunity to innovate and an opportunity to then use some of those innovations and structures in other missions, such as this UN peacekeeping mission. The other big innovation has been the intelligence security, intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance sort of kind of intelligence unit structure that has been applied to the UN mission in Mali for the first time in many ever really in UN peacekeeping, which is again another great innovation that UN peacekeeping is trying to play with, and that is, to be fair, that is showing mixed results. So I'm not here to say that everything that has been coming from ISAF has been successful. To the contrary, there are a lot of problems linked to ISR and the intelligence side of UN peacekeeping. It has also created, very, sort of two distinct sort of clubs between Western countries being able to access to ASIFU and ISR because they had been in the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and the UN peacekeeping forces that instead were not allowed to use neither ASIFU nor be part of the ISR. So just to give you a sense of, an innovation has happened, and we seem to be seeing, spread, a slow but shy spread of some of these innovations to other kinds of operations. Another really interesting sort of aspect that I would like to mention has to do with the use of also sort of particular kinds of irregular warfares that are perhaps likely to be used in national defense. For instance, how drones have been used and experimented in the NATO mission in Afghanistan, and how they are being utilized perhaps in the contemporary, relatively quite tense situation right now between NATO and Russia. And then the other really important, perhaps the most important element, is that throughout these 20 years of NATO involvement in Afghanistan, we have seen a lot of socialization and increased interoperability across different NATO countries, notwithstanding the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that very important differences remain. And the third kind of sort of process that I would like to highlight is the growth of domestic missions among countries, among NATO countries. And this is something that I think has not yet been studied in a very systematic way, but we are seeing, like anecdotally, we are seeing that a lot of NATO countries for the first time in decades are actually using their troops more in domestic function than in expeditionary operation. And if I'm not misunderstanding it, also in Canada, there is an ongoing discussion about this. And so I just want to mention a few examples just to show you how powerful this is. So in France, France has been allowed to utilize its military in domestic operation since 1978, when Giscard d'Estaing, launched the Vigipirate instrument. But it is only since 2015 that really we have a profound transformation in terms of how the military use and how many troops are deployed. So after the terrorist attacks at Bataclan, Stade de France, and Nice, we really see a huge increase in the amount of troops deployed, with at some point 13,000 troops deployed in metropolitan France, and the reserve being mobilized. We also see for a period that then it stopped, the military being deployed with judiciary police functions, something that only the police is allowed to have. So you can imagine sort of the kinds of debate that has triggered, and with some saying, as you can see here in the left-hand side of my slide, that the security, the dinosaurs, is actually eating up the Marianne, symbolizing freedom. Another really interesting example when it comes to the shift from expeditionary to domestic operations is the case of Italy, which has deployed initially pretty small domestic operation called Operation Safe Road since 2008. And then little by little, it has basically tasked the military to do anything, to show the presence in areas of Italy where there is a very high level of organized crime infiltration, to intervene in case of earthquakes, to intervene in anti-terrorist functions, to collect garbage in the city of Naples, among many others. And interestingly, this mission that is always authorized in Parliament every year has never really had its mandate or its tasks clearly defined. Since 2 years ago, it actually there are more Italian troops deployed on domestic soil than in expeditionary operation. And please bear in mind that the Italian public is traditionally very resistant to having military display for historical reasons, but also it's also a country that has a traditional preference for peacekeeping mission and expeditionary operations. So that's another really interesting kind of transition to the point of what you're seeing now, that gentleman with a funny hat, which is an Alpine sort of general, Alpine unit general, wearing a goose feather, is the person in charge of the entire vaccination strategy of the country. But the examples like this are very many, and they've had a bit of a substitution effect. Like with the drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, we see a clear increase of the amount of troops deployed domestically. The UK is doing exactly the same. It deployed the military quite a lot after, for instance, the Westminster attacks, deploying tanks at Heathrow Airport, and examples like this are abound. Of course, this process has been accelerated by COVID-19. In a collaboration with Nick Dietrich and Christine Eck, we have collected global data on the use of the military in the COVID response, and we have tried to trace and unpack a little bit what were they doing, what kind of tasks. And you can see here that democracies have used quite a lot, actually, the military also in enforcement purpose, not only in logistic, as you would perhaps expect. So there is really a transformation that I think is both an effect of the drawdown of the large-scale boots on the ground operation in Afghanistan, but also a bit of to some extent, also a bit of an interesting phenomenon that we need to observe more closely, that is partly going to affect also the future of expeditionary operation led by NATO. And then my fourth and last sort of process that I would like to highlight is really very interesting processes of acceptance and resistance that NATO countries, NATO military organizations in particular, are putting in place. So the first one that I want to mention has to do with what our keynote speaker already mentioned. So this the process of how to deal with very traumatic experiences that particularly NATO countries that were deployed in the southern part and eastern part of Afghanistan experience. So there is a real problem with veterans, and not always they have been sufficiently helped to cope and deal with the trauma. But sometimes the trauma is also collective, and I want to mention an example that really struck me during a research visit I did in Denmark. So on the left of my slide, you see the Royal Danish Defence College in Copenhagen, and when you enter sort of where the cadets train, you have a corridor. And in that corridor, basically, the corridor is full of images and paintings of what it looks like to be a military person in the Danish military. And I just want to remind you that the Danish military is one of the NATO countries that suffered the most casualties per capita during the ISAF operation. And so in that corridor, basically, there are a lot of paintings about all that a military can do, but it ends with two paintings. One can return home from operation in two ways, either as a hero, and there is the painting of a hero, or in a coffin. And this is sort of used as a way to socialize and really teach new sort of Danish cadets what it means to be a soldier. And in their narratives, in their stories, they really think of it as a big change and something that they try to introduce. And then lastly, just another really interesting factor is what you see here in the middle. Like a lot of NATO and partner countries, and here you see the example of Sweden, are trying to think a little bit how do we transfer all the know-how that we got in expeditionary operations into national defense as we pivot to national defense. There is interesting debates in many NATO countries and partner countries about how to do that. And then lastly, I just want to mention the resistance that a lot of NATO militaries are still putting against sort of the return and the drawdown of more OPEX. And I want to mention particularly the French military that is still resisting quite a lot the fact that they are deployed in domestic operations, that they see their role in opération extérieure, in expeditionary operations reduced. So to conclude, I just very briefly, I just want to say that answer very quickly, what is the future for out-of-area operations? Well, I don't think there is really a future for expeditionary operations in the way we have known them, but there are several futures that may take different forms. So I think we are going to continue to see, these lighter security sector reforms, kind of military assistance kind of missions. We are going to start seeing, I think, more of the transfer of specific tasks into territorial defense and a slow but maybe sure adaptation into new roles. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Merci beaucoup, Chiara, pour vos propos fort intéressants. Je retiens particulièrement,
Thank you very much for your very interesting feedback. The impact of missions outside of the zone, out of zone impacts. I want to stress that for 15 years for NATO forces, about their preparation in view of wars, which are increasingly harder in terms of intensity. We look at the current situation in Ukraine, for instance, and people are concerned. Very likely there will be concerns. You duly raised the domestic operations intervention that is requested from our military staff. The military, when they go onto those zones, in terms of the intensity spectrum, this varies. This goes towards the left, but then in the meantime, we're not focusing on the right-hand side of the same intervention spectrum. Thank you. So it gives me pleasure to introduce to you our next speaker, Alexander Lanoszka from the University of Waterloo, Associate Professor, University of Waterloo. Military alliance is the object of the research, European relationships, and so on. So American power, a thought, an analysis of alliances after Afghanistan. So you have the floor. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizing committee. Thank you for inviting me for this excellent conference. I'm very happy to be here. I've prepared my presentation like my colleague, so do not hesitate to ask questions if you have questions. Your feedback will be welcome in French also. So
U.S. and allied forces from Afghanistan last summer was quite shocking to watch. The experience conjured up memories of the fall of Saigon in April 1975. Now, as back then, the chaotic withdrawal of US military and civilian personnel and the spectacular collapse of the host government that took place simultaneously precipitated a major debate about whether the United States truly is the global leader it projects itself to be, and whether its allies and partners around the world can continue to count on it. This debate ultimately centers on the question of American power and credibility. So some have argued that the consequences of the withdrawal from Afghanistan for American credibility are downright disastrous. Council of Foreign Relations President Richard Haas opined that, quote, the grim aftermath of America's strategic and moral failure will reinforce questions about US reliability among friends and foes far and wide. Questions that for many became fever pitch during the Trump years not very long ago. And Bret Stephens of the New York Times warned that every US ally will draw the lesson that it is on its own in the face of its enemies. In Europe, further afield, renowned former German diplomat Wolfgang Ischinger tweeted that, quote, the credibility question is now being asked all over the place in Europe and beyond. Now, not everyone, of course, agreed with these sorts of sentiments. There are those who have argued that counterintuitively, perhaps, American reputation and credibility will in fact benefit as a result of the withdrawal. According to this perspective, the United States had already showed its commitment to its ideals by fighting such a long, futile war as it did in Afghanistan. Getting out of Afghanistan means getting rid of a very costly distraction for Washington, thereby allowing it to devote more resources and more attention to its own treaty allies in the more important theaters of the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. But some observers will not go this far in expressing such optimism, emphasizing that indeed reputation is multidimensional and much depends on the Biden administration and how it moves forward in crafting its foreign and defense policies. So for this presentation, I want to take up this middling approach to argue that as much as the Biden administration poorly handled, and very poorly handled, the Afghan withdrawal, its impact on US power and alliance leadership is neither as bad nor as good as commonly asserted. Now, before I make this argument, I do want to flesh out some of the key concepts and theoretical positions that interlocutors in this debate have staked out so far. So to begin with, the concepts of credibility and reputation are very easy to conflate, but nevertheless quite distinct. Credibility refers to the degree to which an actor will fulfill the threats and promises that it makes, despite the costs that might be associated with following through on them. Reputation is the perception that others might have as to that actor based on their past behavior. As my colleague Joshua Kurtzer succinctly notes, if credibility is what others think as whether your deeds will match your words, reputation is what others think of you in the first place. So scholars have typically positioned themselves in one of two camps on this question as to whether reputation matters in international politics. Those holding to the view that it does matter emphasize that your past actions will inform how your reputation develops. Accordingly, standing firm and living up to your commitments are going to be very beneficial for reputation, which will then allow you to elicit the respect of your colleagues and to generate cooperation on terms favorable to you. Failing to do those things, however, will create a reputation for irresolution, with allies coming to doubt your own credibility or reliability, and potential adversaries believing that they can advance their own interests more aggressively at their expense or even at your expense. However, those who assert that reputation concerns are very easy to exaggerate would hold that because you cannot control how others form their perceptions of you, in large part because of the cognitive or psychological biases that they might have, past actions are really of very little consequence. Crucially, from this perspective, factors like power, do you have the ability to back up your words, and interest, do you have enough at stake to follow through on those words, are what ultimately drive assessments of credibility. Now, with regards to US foreign policy, these differing views have produced contrasting assessments on what the withdrawal from Afghanistan means for US alliance leadership. Those who believe that reputation matters would postulate that the withdrawal represents a broader disengagement of the United States from worldly affairs and its general lack of fight. Critics, of course, would disagree and argue that if anything, the United States finally giving up a fight in a peripheral theater signals that plans to invest more of its attention and resources elsewhere. As such, treaty partners, treaty allies, and strategic partners might even gain from this major adjustment in US foreign policy, because at the very least, the United States can bring more to bear to address common security concerns. And so those allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific in particular should especially benefit, given how US policy documents have in recent times prioritized the threat posed by an increasingly assertive and powerful China above all else. Of course, I should point out here that there are more nuanced takes on reputation, takes that have become much more common in recent years. After all, power and interest do not come from nowhere. They're often the result of past action. Scholars is a bit superficial, and reputation itself is quite multidimensional. Although states might be considered to be corporate actors on their own right, they are led by individuals or groups of individuals with their own histories, their own interests, their own personalities, and their own prejudices. And to demonstrate the complexity of the issues involved here, you can consider some of the following rhetorical questions that people might ask here. Right? Did events in Afghanistan put at risk the reputation and credibility of the United States, the Biden administration, or one or the other, or both? How entangled are the reputation and credibility of the Biden administration with those of the United States? And which reputation, if any, was really put at risk? The reputation for engaging in humanitarian intervention, for competence, for following through on stated platforms or interests. Indeed, different observers of US foreign policy will likely draw their own conclusions, which may in turn be influenced by their own experiences with the United States, or their own understandings of how the world works, or whatever else might be shaping their attitudes towards politics. So with all of that said, how do the predictions about US alliance leadership fare so far, about 5 or 6 months after the withdrawal? Have allied security concerns become graver as a result of the Afghan withdrawal and its handling? Or have they become mollified because those allies stand to benefit from greater US attention to their needs? Have adversaries, conversely, presented new challenges that they would not have otherwise had the Biden administration executed its foreign policy differently? Now, these questions are very tricky to answer, and admittedly, they're very unfair. The effects of this withdrawal might not be seen for a while, and 6 months are really nothing in the scope of world history, to be sure. Crucially, there are also many confounding factors at play here, factors that will only grow in number with time. And foreign policy is hardly ever a function of one or two variables. And this is obviously painfully true in our own time with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, the economic contraction it caused, intense political polarization in the United States and other NATO countries, the systemic challenge posed by China, the disruptive behavior of Russia, the number of international commitments the United States has, and so forth and so forth. These are all factors that shape not only the international environment, but also the decision-making context. Nevertheless, I think that some tentative observations can still be made. So again, one prediction made by those who argue that reputation matters is that adversaries will sense opportunity and will be emboldened as a result to press their claims. China has not instigated any new crisis as of today, to my knowledge, right? However, of course, Russia has, and has done so rather spectacularly in Europe. It has amassed about 100,000 military personnel and their warfighting equipment near Ukraine's border. The Kremlin has made demands that has not only sought to limit Ukraine's sovereignty, but also to roll back NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, of course, Russia began building up its military forces near Ukraine in the spring of 2021, months before the collapse of the anti-Taliban government in Afghanistan. Its reasons for doing so, I would argue, are largely tied to local factors, namely perceptions of Ukraine's tilt towards Europe and dissatisfaction with the level of interest shown by Kyiv in dialogue over questions relating to Eastern Ukraine. However, there are some Russian observers who do argue that Biden's foreign policy handling in his first year of office may have been an important consideration for Moscow. So as one director of the McGill-based Institute for International Studies, Maxim Suchkov, had written for War on the Rocks, quote, Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was seen in Moscow as Biden's ultimate ability to act in a more audacious and decisive manner on matters of strategic importance to the United States. The Russian president believes that his American counterpart now has the opportunity to benefit from the proposals made by Moscow and do away with yet another damn question of US foreign policy in the post-9/11 era, the so-called Russia problem. Now, of course, this is just one leading expert's observation. The usual caveats apply. It doesn't really give us actual insight in the decision-making in the Kremlin. Nevertheless, the possible linkage to the Afghan withdrawal cannot be easily dismissed, even if other considerations more proximate to Ukraine probably have weighed much more heavier on Moscow's calculus. Now, that could be on the negative side of the ledger, that Russia felt so emboldened to make those sorts of claims about the European security architecture. On the positive side of the ledger, however, the response of US allies has been to rally around the United States. Indeed, for all the talk that the Afghan withdrawal would alienate current and potential partners, the crisis provoked by Russia not only made Ukraine more interested in American support, but also renewed debate in Finland and Sweden as to the desirability of NATO membership. And despite what missteps might have been made by the Biden administration throughout this crisis, the fact of the matter is that a large number of countries continue to place high value on the military and diplomatic support that Washington offers. But another item on the negative side of the ledger has arguably been the global posture review undertaken by the Biden administration. Early in 2021, shortly after coming to office, the Biden administration announced that it would conduct an assessment of US overseas deployments, with the unspoken promise that the global posture review would better align force posture with strategy. After all, many observers have noted that the United States has not sufficiently resourced its own prioritization of the Indo-Pacific. So between the global posture review and Afghanistan, the moment seemed to have been ripe to bring those elements much closer together. That just has not happened so far. The GPR has been disappointing. Indeed, the possibility that the Afghan withdrawal would release attention resources so as to benefit treaty allies has not yet materialized. The Biden administration has signaled that it would increase its military presence in East and Central Europe in the event of a major military operation by Russia against Ukraine. It had announced in the GPR that would introduce new infrastructure in Guam and the Northern Marianas, but those are very modest changes to the existing posture. It did not at all exhibit a major rethink of American overseas deployments. And if the Biden administration does follow through on its promise to beef up its presence if Russia were to escalate against Ukraine, then those additional deployments might put further strain on the Biden administration's stated Indo-Pacific strategy. East Asian treaty allies might rightly or wrongly fear that American resources are increasingly scarce and that they're in zero-sum competition for them with their European counterparts. Of course, again, I say this all with the understanding that these geopolitical challenges are profound. They cannot be at all attributed simply to how the Biden administration or the United States more generally has handled its role in Afghanistan. That said, I do want to finish by observing that optimists and the pessimists alike might have gone some things both right and wrong so far. So the optimists, I think, are right that the potential does exist still for the United States to reallocate its resources more appropriately towards great power competition. 6 months is hardly enough time, and indeed, force posture is somewhat glacial in terms of how it moves, but early signs, admittedly, are not very encouraging. Pessimists might have gone something right if Russian leaders did see an opportunity to throw up such a brazen challenge to the European security architecture. Perhaps mindful, however, of the criticism that it did receive from its allies in August 2021, both when the withdrawal was taking place and again, further along in the early stages of the crisis with Ukraine, or over Ukraine, The United States, under the Biden administration, has put a greater premium on reassurance and alliance consultations. In some ways, some of the pessimism may just turn out to be a self-denying prophecy. Anyway, that's more or less, that's all I have to really say. So the world's complicated, I get that, but I think there is good news and bad news.
Merci beaucoup, Alexander. Des propos très intéressants. Comment...
Very interesting statements. How can we read that very withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of this year? So what you're saying, this shows that this is an extremely complex situation. You're showing that the way we answer can lead us on different tracks, and 6 months is maybe too early. 6 months after, in terms of timeline, it's not much, but you've shown the positions that were considered by optimistic and pessimistic people, as you've said. So this remains to be monitored and further studied. Thank you so much. Our third speaker, Mr. Hani Nasser, the Department of National Defense of Canada.
Where he leads a team that works on Canada's policy development and direction with regards to NATO and manages Canada's bilateral defense relationship with European countries and the EU. Prior to joining the Department of National Defense, Hani spent 15 years at Global Affairs Canada. Most recently, he was the political counselor and deputy head of the political section at Canada's embassy to the United States in Washington, D.C. Alors, Hani va nous parler du Canada et l'OTAN dans le contexte de notre...
Canada and NATO in view of our topics here in the context for our conference. So welcome, Hani Nasser. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks to you for including me in this program. My presentation now, as my colleagues have said, I'd like to say I'm sorry ahead of time because my presentation will be in English, but I'm very happy to consider questions in French also. I'm very happy, as others said.
Presents us with a unique opportunity, not only to discuss Canada's priority for NATO, which is to ensure the alliance remains modern, flexible, agile, and able to face current and future threats, but also to remember NATO allies had military forces deployed in Afghanistan for almost 2 decades. This commitment demonstrates the enormous strength of allies working in pursuit of a common goal, but it came at a cost. Members of the coalition have suffered more than 3,500 combat fatalities, and 158 Canadian Armed Forces members lost their lives in the service in Afghanistan. Today, as we discuss the future of the alliance, I invite us to reflect on this legacy. In light of this, Canada remains deeply concerned by the situation in Afghanistan and is committed to supporting Afghans, particularly for improved access to health, education, women and girls' rights, and to achieve prospects for sustainable peace. As many of you know, last summer, Canada played a significant role in the historic effort to evacuate from Afghanistan individuals who were at risk due to their association with NATO. The CAF participated, Canadian Armed Forces participated in the US-led coalition air bridge and transported or facilitated the evacuation of about 3,700 people from Kabul. This included Canadian citizens, permanent residents, as well as at-risk Afghans entitled for resettlement in Canada and in allied and partner nations. In total, around 2,000 Afghans working for NATO and their families were evacuated from Afghanistan in August to temporary camps in Kosovo and Poland, to be later resettled in allied countries, including in Canada. The armed forces supported this operation, including by deploying 3 female members, themselves originally from Afghanistan, to serve as interpreters to the NATO refugee camp in Kosovo. Today, Canada is pleased to have completed the resettlement of 472 NATO-affiliated Afghan contractors and their families in Canada, as part of Canada's broader commitment to resettle a total of 40,000 vulnerable Afghan refugees. Concurrent to these evacuation efforts, NATO also completed a lessons learned process, which identified NATO's successes in Afghanistan, but also areas in need of improvement. The report contains many important recommendations, which must now be taken forward. For instance, improving political consultations, both internally and with partners, should be a priority. At the same time, we must not lose sight of all that was achieved through our collective efforts and ensure we uphold the unity of the alliance. For example, the report underscores the significant positive impact NATO had for a generation of Afghans, including women and girls. Another clear success of NATO's mission in Afghanistan was that it strengthened military interoperability and the political integration of allied and partner forces. These recommendations provide critical insights as we continue to strengthen allied capacity to respond in the evolving security environment. And Canada remains dedicated to these efforts on NATO transformation, reform, and partnerships with non-NATO countries. Our contributions to NATO demonstrate Canada's unwavering commitment to the alliance. On NATO's eastern flank, Canada is currently deploying close to 1,200 Canadian troops from the Baltics to the Black Sea, including through our leadership of the Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia. To NATO's south, Canada continues to support training and capacity building efforts in the Middle East, including through NATO Mission Iraq. As we look toward the future of NATO, the alliance must consider its core priorities. The world is vastly different now than it was when NATO entered Afghanistan. We are now in a multipolar age of augmented geostrategic competition and advancing authoritarianism. We see a much more aggressive Russia, including the illegal annexation of Crimea, ongoing destabilization of eastern Ukraine, and a broad military buildup. And I'll get back to this a little bit later. We see a new form of terrorism and more instability in the Middle East and North Africa. Cyber threats have grown exponentially, and emerging and disruptive technologies are changing the character of conflict. And we also need to tackle global challenges like pandemics and climate change, while China's rise fundamentally shifts the balance of power. In this context, the alliance remains relevant. To carry us into the decades ahead, NATO must continue to adapt while remaining focused on its three core tasks: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. NATO's ongoing adaptation is key to this success. The alliance has continually adapted to evolving security challenges since its formation 72 years ago. In this spirit, the NATO 2030 reforms provide an opportunity to further strengthen the alliance's political toolkit so allies can continue to adapt to the evolving security environment. In December 2019, NATO leaders asked Secretary General Stoltenberg to lead a forward-looking reflection to make NATO stronger and fit for the future. Since then, the Secretary General consulted widely with allies and received valuable input from an independent group of experts. He also engaged with civil society, young people, parliamentarians, and the private sector to help shape the NATO 2030 agenda. On this basis, the Secretary General developed concrete proposals to make NATO stronger and ready for the future. Allies discussed these proposals, and at the summit in June 2021, NATO leaders endorsed the NATO 2030 agenda. NATO 2030 strategic priority areas include developing NATO's next strategic concept, increasing political coordination and consultation, supporting the rules-based international order, preserving NATO's technological edge, and combating and adapting to climate change. Regarding NATO's strategic concept, the current concept was agreed to in 2010 and sets the alliance's strategy. It outlines NATO's enduring purpose and nature, its fundamental security tasks, and the challenges and opportunities it faces in a changing security environment. It also specifies the elements of the alliance's approach to security and provides guidelines for its political and military adaptation. In short, the strategic concept equips the alliance for security challenges and guides its future political and military development. Looking to the future, we have to prepare for a more competitive and unstable world. That is why the time has come for the next strategic concept, to adapt NATO for an increasingly complex security environment. This year, leaders will agree to a concept which will define NATO's objectives for the subsequent decade. This renewal will take account of changes to the global security environment that NATO and allies consider the implications of Afghanistan during the renewal process. Part of this process of adaptation also includes deepening NATO and European cooperation and collaboration. Notably, 21 of NATO's 30 allies are also EU member states. Although NATO and the EU have different areas of focus, there's growing overlap as the EU aims to take on a greater defense and security role, and as NATO seeks to address non-traditional security threats which require action outside the defense and military spheres. From countering the malign influence posed by Russia and China to protecting critical infrastructure and maintaining our technological edge, it is imperative that NATO and the EU collaborate and coordinate effectively on the security implications of these and other emerging issues that require multidimensional responses. Russia's attempts to intimidate states, create wedges between allies, and destabilize the rules-based international order pose challenges that necessitate a joint response from NATO and the EU. Ensuring NATO-EU collaboration, coordination, and interoperability is of particular importance in supporting Ukraine as it responds to Russian aggression and intimidation. Furthermore, while we must seize opportunities for engagement and cooperation with China where we can, we must also remain clear-eyed about the challenges to our security interests posed by China's ambitious actions and work together to address them. More coordinated and complementary work will also be needed to advance efforts to integrate gender perspective in NATO and EU activities related to our collective defense. As a non-EU NATO ally, Canada believes that joint efforts to support the development of coherent, complementary, and interoperable defense capabilities is vital to ensuring the safety of the Euro-Atlantic area. The value of leveraging the strengths and roles of our respective institutional and national approaches is clear. To that end, we look forward to the new NATO-EU Joint Declaration, which is currently being developed, that will affirm and, where possible, deepen the cooperation between NATO and EU. NATO, however, is and must remain the primary foundation of Euro-Atlantic defense and security cooperation. As such, it is essential that European defense initiatives remain complementary to and non-duplicative of NATO. If I can talk a little bit about preserving NATO's technological edge, it is clear that the technological advances of potential adversaries poses a significant threat to the alliance. It is imperative that NATO's technological advantage be maintained. Some areas where NATO can focus on improving its competitive edge are developing its formal organizations, increasing public and private sector collaboration, harnessing and countering emerging disruptive technologies, and improving integrated new technologies into capability development, where there is tangible military benefit, such as artificial intelligence. But we must do so in a responsible and ethical manner while respecting international law. This will show that we can compete and win while staying true to our core values. As a whole, NATO's effectiveness in the future will heavily depend on its ability to maintain and improve its science and technology capabilities. Improving innovation will increase alliance collaboration, strengthen public and private sector cooperation, counter hybrid threats, deter adversaries, and harden defenses against attacks. Finally, on the subject of climate change, the impact of climate change on global security requires a concerted and cooperative response. NATO, the world's premier political military alliance, must address this issue. Climate change necessitates a response that adapts infrastructure, training, forecasting, equipment, and operations to meet a rapidly changing natural environment with a resilient force. Building force resilience by understanding and planning to our future security environment is fundamental to NATO's future. Our efforts to anticipate the security implications of climate change, adapt to meet these security challenges, and implement solutions to mitigate the impact of climate change are all inextricably linked. These efforts will be most effective if undertaken cooperatively and as part of a multi-sectoral approach with input from military and non-military actors. Efforts to mitigate the impact of climate change can also help to boost our operational efficiency by reducing logistics chains, increasing mobility, and may present green technologies able to also increase operational capabilities. At the end of the day, NATO exists as a response to the security threats against its member states. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention the current crisis unfolding around Ukraine. While Ukraine is not a NATO member, Russia's continued intimidation of neighbors who don't subscribe to its worldview creates an insecure situation across the Euro-Atlantic region. The current situation tells us that Russia is still willing to resort to military intimidation and pressure whenever it feels its interests or security are threatened. Candace sees these actions by Russia as a measure to test the resolve of NATO and Ukraine's security partners, likely to see how far Moscow can push, and their response will influence the next steps. This is an opportunity for NATO allies to clearly demonstrate collective resolve and send a clear message that this kind of bullying and muscle flexing will not be tolerated, while at the same time not escalating the situation. NATO will also need to conduct its own planning for its eastern and southern flanks. Russia borders many NATO allies, many of whom feel threatened by Russia's aggressive behavior, and will need reassurance and increased deterrence, concepts that fall directly within NATO's area of responsibility. In conclusion, I'd just like to say that NATO is a major contributor to the international peace and security and is the cornerstone of Canadian security and defense policy. Again, this priority for NATO is ultimately to ensure the alliance remains modern, flexible, agile, and able to face current and future threats. These challenges have evolved dramatically since the establishment of the alliance and will undoubtedly continue to shift in the post-Afghanistan environment. Over the next decade, NATO's ability to remain an effective and efficient alliance will depend the manner in which it adapts to the evolving security environment. To this end, Canada remains committed to the alliance and to strengthening allied capacity to respond to current and future challenges. In this era of augmented geostrategic challenges, our strength remains in our ability to stand together when necessary, as individual countries and as members of NATO. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Hani, pour nous avoir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hani, for painting a very complete picture of the Canadian position towards NATO. You also mentioned something interesting about the NATO and EU relationship, as well as the Canadian position facing NATO, and you highlighted Canada's position in the situation that prevails at the Ukrainian border. So thank you very much. We now will welcome Heidi Hardt, our last speaker, and there will be a questions period of at least 30 minutes after her talk. So Heidi is Associate Professor in Political Science at the University of California in Irvine. Her research focuses on the efficiency, changes, and knowledge in international organizations, specifically in conflict management. The title of Heidi's presentation for our conference is Strategic Lessons of NATO Strategic Lessons from Afghanistan in the Aftermath of Exodus. Welcome, Heidi, and the mic is yours. Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk on this very important topic. Today, I will do the same thing everyone else did. I will give my talk in English. I hope that that will go well. If you want to ask questions in French during the questions period, it's okay, as you wish. I'm just very happy to have the opportunity to speak French to you and not just to my daughter, who is only 3 years old. So you can imagine that our conversations are not always very sophisticated. Great. So I will pursue in English, as I said.
A political science professor, as you heard, at the University of California, Irvine. I'm on sabbatical this year, so full disclosure, I'm doing a fellowship that is funded by the Council on Foreign Relations, International Affairs Fellowship. So I'm actually working in the US Senate right now. And next month, I'm going to be working for the NATO office within the State Department, so our foreign ministry. So I am going to be speaking with you in my capacity as a scholar, and just want to clarify that my views are mine alone. But this is obviously a great opportunity to hear from everyone. And since, very shortly, I'm going to be working for the Biden administration. So in a lot of the current debates that are going on, in sort of the aftermath of the withdrawal, I feel like, you've noticed that policy experts, the media, academics, there's a lot of focus on what the US did do, what it didn't do, what the US should have done differently, particularly with regards to the withdrawal. We finally are seeing all of these conversations about the importance of learning strategic lessons from this very long presence in Afghanistan. But I think it's important that as we frame this within and focus a lot on the US, that we also emphasize what some of our panelists have stressed, which is that this was ultimately a multilateral operation. This is a 2-decade-long intervention, which was the largest and one of the largest and longest multilateral military operations in history. So what I'm going to focus on talking to you a little bit about today is some of the lessons that military organizations, multilateral military organizations, or maybe we should call them security organizations that have a military component, such as NATO, but also the UN, the European Union, the African Union, and others might be able to take away from this. And I would just mention that I'm going to be referencing some of the research that I've done from a book that I wrote that was called, I happen to have it here, it's called NATO's Lessons in Crisis. And that book draws on interviews that I conducted in 2015 with 120 high-level military and political officials working at NATO. So, including from the national delegations at the time, all of the, I think at that time it was 28 member states. And so I want to share with you some of their thoughts, because one of the questions that I actually asked in doing this research on institutional memory and thinking about learning and how NATO learns was, what are the strategic lessons from Afghanistan? And again, thinking this was in 2015. So this was kind of right at that transition between, ISAF to resolute support. And of course, no one had any idea, that as we've heard from the other panelists, that Kabul would fall, or if they did think that Kabul would fall, that it would fall that quickly. Thank you very much for sharing the link. And you'll notice also that I included a link to an online supplementary. It's just a Word document or PDF that you may find interesting, because it has a lot of extra quotes that I just didn't have room to put in the book itself. And you'll notice I'll draw on some of them from page 26, but feel free to go through, because you can then hear some of the quotes from the military officials themselves, high level, 4 or 5-star generals, admirals, about what they thought about at the strategic level, these strategic lessons. So feel free to check that out. And I promise I'm not here just to push my book, but the nice thing about this PDF is it's free, so you can just download it or check it out if it's interesting to you. So one of the first lessons is something that maybe is very obvious. You'll notice even a RAND report that came out recently argued the same thing, which is really to look before you jump. And what I mean by that is think very carefully before you go into an environment in which perhaps the intervening organization has minimal experience, where the interests, the strategic interests may or may not be aligned. Because many scholars over the years, as NATO has been involved, have argued that NATO lacked a strategy for engaging in Afghanistan, that the mission itself was shifting, right? Is this a mission, is the ultimate mission about civilian protection? Is it about its origins in counterterrorism? Is it about nation building? And I think another question that we need to focus on is, does NATO, or if we're thinking about other multilateral organizations, is there an exit plan? Is there clearly an exit plan? And is NATO, thinking about what NATO is as this political military organization, is NATO ultimately capable of building sustainable peace in a region that has a history of corruption, that has a history of weak institutions, and that has this history of entrenched poverty? Because we also have to remember that as we see what now, seeing things from the government side, and which is very public, is this ultimate tragedy as the country in Afghanistan is collapsing. And what I heard recently from some experts at NGOs is being called the worst humanitarian crisis, particularly in terms of hunger, in history. at least that they've, and that may be an exaggeration, right? History is a really long time, but I think it is fair to say that people who are working in NGOs who have been working for decades on hunger crises and famines around the world are really recognizing this as a huge problem. And right now, it's really a catch-22. Should the US and other countries release funds to a government that doesn't recognize women's and girls' rights and is fine with child marriage and has this history of all of these human rights violations and is okay with not educating girls? Or do you sit back and watch the famine unfold? It's really an ultimate, horrible situation that everyone's in, and so it's not just something that the US is thinking about, but that obviously all of the NATO allies themselves are trying to figure out too. How do we deal with that? That's the most urgent situation. But ultimately in the research, to go back to this broader question of, the lesson of looking before you jump, I kept hearing in the research that I was doing that Afghanistan at the time, right, thinking of 2015, Afghanistan was a tactical success, and that on the ground, operationally, we're seeing successes that, at the time, things like the provincial reconstruction teams, there was a lot of positive movement, institution building. As we know, there's a whole generation of girls and women that did experience liberties and education in ways that maybe they wouldn't have if NATO and allies in the US, et cetera, were not there. So this continues to be a debate, but at the same time, I was also hearing in 2015 that it was a strategic failure because of these broader questions about what are we really doing here? What is our end goal? And can we meet this end goal of establishing a sustainable peace? And I think it's important to emphasize that word sustainable peace and self-sustaining peace, to not just emphasize that you ultimately want, in the case of any of these multilateral operations, UN peacekeeping, to be able to withdraw troops and for there to be peace when the troops are there. You want to ideally see peace that is self-sustaining, where local people and local communities can thrive, without needing extensive foreign intervention and foreign aid, which of course is part of the reason that we're seeing such a humanitarian disaster today, because 3/4, or 2/3 or 3/4, just this huge number of a percentage of a lot of the food and health and a lot of the infrastructure within Afghanistan was dependent on foreign assistance. So I want to just briefly share with you. Let's see if I can share my screen really quickly. This is from my book, because my book was focused on broader questions of, how do international security organizations retain any kind of knowledge about strategic errors and strategic lessons, given that there's so much turnover, which is something that's true in the military, that's something that's true in foreign ministries, it's something that's true in what I'm about to, thinking of moving into the State Department. There's a lot of turnover. So how does that happen? And so the book focuses on thinking about this, and part of trying to find the answer to, to how institutional memory is retained involved asking that question of what are some of these errors that people reflect on. And I just want to point out here, as you're looking at this screen, this is kind of like a descriptive little table of different responses from these elites. And you'll notice that the first thing you see is the civilian casualties. Then you see second most frequent response was about decisions being uninformed. But look here at D, the flawed decision to intervene in Afghanistan. So about 1 in 10 of these officials, these high-level officials, were themselves really questioning the decision to be intervening, which I think returns to some of the other panelists' points about, the mismatch between probably what Dr. Ruffa was talking about, where in the beginning, in the post-Cold War period, people were thinking about these out-of-area operations as a way of salvaging NATO and providing a raison d'etre for NATO. But then at the same time, as things progressed, there was kind of this mission creep that evolved, and there were a lot of questions about, well, what can we accomplish? What can we accomplish? What can we not accomplish? What are the limitations? The second big strategic lesson, and again, we could spend hours talking about what the lessons are. There are so many. So I'm just highlighting a few, is the lack of prioritizing civilian casualties. And that's something that you see coming out of the research that I did at that time, but it's also something that continues to be discussed heavily by scholars and policymakers and other experts in think tanks as well. According to the Costs of War project, a project that comes out of Brown University, 47,000 Afghan civilians lost their lives as a result of the war. So the question is, how can multilateral operations then prioritize civilian protection while being involved in conflict? In theory, the fact that the operation is multilateral should mean that you have a diverse array of perspectives. We know that research tells us that diversity really leads to more positive and interesting and complex answers, right? Because the more diverse the people that you have in the boardroom or within an organization, the more creative thinking comes from that. So in theory, you should have just more creative resolutions and ideas coming up, with the fact that we knew throughout the decades of these very high numbers of civilian casualties that there should have been more of a response and prioritization of that. And yet, if you look back at the numbers, they continue to increase. And part of that, of course, is that there was a surge. But part of that, even when you control for that, you still see this very high number of civilian casualties. And why is that a problem? Ethically, of course, it's a problem for the moral fact that people should not be dying unnecessarily. That's terrible. But it's also a strategic problem because we now have research that tells us what a lot of people suspected. There's a study in the National Bureau of Economic Research that I'd suggest that you take a look at that showed that civilian casualties, when you looked at very specific regions, at these specific regions, that there was a revenge effect, meaning that people were getting radicalized, and this study was done in Afghanistan, were being radicalized and engaged in areas that had higher civilian casualty counts. Now, of course, we could spend a lot of time talking about causality. And so maybe this is, maybe there weren't enough statistical controls in the study, et cetera. But I think it is important to say that there's enough qualitative and quantitative evidence out there for us to know that high numbers of civilian casualties are problematic across the board for any multilateral operation. And so I think this is a big thing. Now, what are some of the lessons to take away from that? There have been all sorts of changes. So you can think about making sure that doctrine itself is prioritizing civilian protection, but also it's a cultural issue that needs to be addressed. Admitting that mistakes occur, right? Creating incentive structures to support the reporting of errors. Training people in the laws of war, in the laws of conflict. Despite the fact that there were many discussions over the years about the importance of cultural awareness, about gender awareness, we finally started seeing gender advisors and gender focal points and all of these different people with gender expertise being inserted into the operation, within the different national militaries that were contributing to the operation. We still, it was late in the game, and it was ultimately a problem for making sure that you have situational awareness. Full disclosure, this is also something that Professor Stephanie von Plaki and I have spent a lot of time researching. We did receive some funding from NATO to study this, some of the importance of and thinking about the implications of having a gender perspective in operations. But we know that does matter for civilian for civilian casualties and the experiences that civilians have. So thinking also about increasing the number of gender integrated troops, particularly, presumably, NATO and other multilateral operations are going to be involved in areas where you will be operating in a society that has, very strict gender norms, and making sure that you have sufficient female military, female translators that are embedded in troops to be able to communicate and to assist local women on the ground. So it's not just about the information sharing and many of the conversations about intelligence gathering, but also just making sure that assistance can be provided. And that's something that's come out of my research with Professor Von Hockey, talking to a lot of military that served in Afghanistan, who described situations of being on the ground where there was no female translator, there were no female troops, in the battalion, and there was an injured Afghan woman in this particular example. But of course, you can find countless examples where, because of those strict gender norms, it's difficult to provide assistance. Requiring pre-deployment training on many of these things. I think I mentioned laws of war, rules of engagement, civilian protection. There's an entire body of international law on civilian protection and women, peace and security, but we know that with this high turnover within militaries, within national militaries, people often are not necessarily receiving some of that training and then going to war. And we heard these tragic stories of troops seeing the Bachabazi boys and seeing, experiencing observing, sexual assaults and sexual violence against young boys, and not knowing how to react, in part because of sufficient training, but obviously there's all sorts of other international legal implications of serving in a multilateral unit where you have different national rules of engagement that apply. As I'm finishing up, since I know I just have a few minutes, I also want to stress that another big takeaway from this, and this is something, third lesson is something that came out very strongly in the SIGAR reports, SIGAR, which was the challenges with oversight. So in many cases, militaries, we think about the problems with the sustainability of the Afghan forces as troops and the low morale that we saw. And how is it possible that the military could collapse so quickly? Well, in part, many people knew that there were these problems. And yet, in many cases, things were not necessarily moving up the chain of command. There were, in many cases, problems with fraud and waste because of poor monitoring and evaluation. And so the question is, what can NATO do? Well, in this particular case, NATO may want to think about, issuing NATO standards that say, for future multilateral operations, we want to make sure that all nations that are engaged have monitoring and evaluation systems in place, that troops are getting familiarized and trained in existing lessons learned processes, and looking for some kind of ways to encourage national militaries to be ensuring that there is proper oversight, because we know that this continues to be a problem in national militaries across the board. This is not a NATO specific problem, but something that we saw pan out in a very challenging way in Afghanistan. So I look forward to chatting during the question and answer. I also have some other kind of policy implications that I can talk about from the research that I did, but I just want to, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Parfait. Alors, merci beaucoup.
Great, thank you. We are on time. We are timed like the military by the minute. So thank you very much. Heidi, would you like to remove your presentation? You can display it again later on during the questions period. So this is the questions period. I'd like to encourage our participants, the other members of the panel, to ask questions. I have one for starters, and I'd like to remind all participants that
de traduction simultanée.
we have simultaneous interpreters that are translating what we are saying. So don't hesitate to use technology to your advantage to hear what is said in the language of your choice.
Peut-être pour débuter, Heidi, parce que vous avez
So for starters, Heidi, since you mentioned that in the lessons learned, you have the lack of strategy of NATO. And
tout à fait personnel parce que
I have a personal experience of that because on the eve of my departure for Kandahar in 2011, we had a meeting with local wise men. I was proud to tell them, to talk to them about the NATO strategy, about NATO's contribution for 10 years. So it was a 10-year strategy. And one of the wise men told me politely that we had not had a 10-year strategy. We had 10 one-year strategies because as the commanders, the regional commanders turned over, or the ISAF commanders were relieved and replaced, the strategy changed. We hadn't had a single strategy throughout the 10 years. We had had several strategies that depended on the respective commanders in the military world that were in Afghanistan.
Something else also that I have not seen in the lessons learned section. Usually when you have traditional conflicts, there's some kind of some sort of sequence, if not synchronicity, between the work of diplomatic people, military staff, and humanitarians. In the framework of the Afghan campaign, these three groups of people were in the same setting at the same time on the same location, which created a lot of irritants. Roswell, the ambassador, alluded to that earlier today a bit. We've developed, I mean, all the NATO countries have developed a model that we've called in Canada the pan or whole governmental approach. So I'd like to hear you on that. Heidi, maybe if you could say something about the more or less so-called success elements for this campaign. So I'd like to give you the floor, and then we will consider questions from our listeners, or maybe from our colleagues or panel members. Thank you. Do you want me to start speaking, or? Yes, thank you. In general, I think that you're right. Well, indeed. I've heard the same thing. I've heard that commanding leaders have said the same thing, that the strategy is the same thing. The strategy has changed every year, or has changed almost everyone. And this may be a symptom, shall we say. This is due to the high turnover malady or disease. Everything is at shambles, turned upside down every time there's this type of illness. There's a new leader, a new military leader, and so on in a new group. The new person arrives, and then this person wants to tell everyone that, oh, I am the person coming up with the magic solution. I've got the idea. So that's what happens. And then people forget things because it's a matter of reputation, So that's what happens with commanders and so on. This is about Lanoszka's comments, Professor. So I think this is true. It still becomes somehow a problem, but I think it's very important for that reason that all military staff, not just the military, but maybe I'm talking about the foreign departmental people, they must create a system, a model whereby we would have incentives so that we could learning incentives. I'm suggesting some very simple things, maybe, but getting the exit documents. I was extremely astonished and surprised to discover that even for NATO, even for the military circles, at the time, that was the situation. Maybe this has changed, I'm not sure, but at the time, there were no requirements to obtain the exit documents like that, even when people changed. And in NATO, even if you come from France or, let's say, the United States, it's 3 years. And this is a problem often also because normally positions will change during the summertime. Why? Because in the summertime, this is great. You're thinking about your kids, children are, in school and so on. But this creates some gaps, some cracks, shall we say, between people. So I suggest that this be something to be considered. It could be done easily. This must become part and parcel of the learning culture, if we want to call it that way. So, as I said, normally I speak in French, but I'm quite informal when I speak French. I use the tu instead of the vous formula. But anyway, the United States are starting to consider this whole governmental approach. I don't know if you are familiar with this Global Fragility Act concept. This is about a legislation which was, I don't know how to name it, in the past. I mean, it was successful. This was during President Trump's mandate. And this requires that the government of the United States gets closer to the conflicts, counting on all the different necessary elements, diplomacy, military intervention, development, parliamentary, and so on. You have to include everyone holistically. In the United States, each department, foreign departments, defense department, they're all deciding and trying to implement or enforce these requirements in order to be able to do that. It's extremely hard because something else that you haven't mentioned, but I'm sure that you are fully aware of it. It's the basic problem or issue. It's true in the United States and in many countries, I suppose, as well. There are more funds, there are more resources, there's more money for defense and less money available for development, for diplomacy. And so this was quite obvious here. In this case, that was the issue. Diplomats that came in, USAID also for development and so on, USAID, they didn't have the funds, the resources. That's one of the reasons why we've seen that it was the military personnel that participated more in projects for development, things like that. That's something else, and I think that we have to think about this. Now, each country, have they invested enough resources in diplomacy, in development? Yes or no? Because I'm fully in agreement in saying that there are experts. They have their own industry, their own sector of activity. So they, as experts, should do the work, and military people should do. Anyway, maybe I'm being sidetracked a bit here, Professor Ruffa and so on. But anyway, you see the civil-military relationships and changes and all that. So thank you. I'll stop. Thank you, Heidi. Anybody wants to say anything about this? Perhaps a colleague of ours would like to say something here from the panel, something about what Dr. Hardt has mentioned regarding the system or the whole governmental approach as pertains to the strategy, NATO's strategy as a whole, comprehensively for this campaign in Afghanistan. All good? Great. You were quite clear then. That's what it means, Dr. Hardt. We have a question from our viewers, our attendees. Maybe this is off topic perhaps, but this is related somehow to, well, one attendee was a Canadian interpreter in Kosovo, and she was talking about her experience over there with well, armed forces provided some protection there, but whilst conflicts endured, I mean, nobody had access to education in the same way. Nobody could access some activities, entertainment activities, as we say, even in French, to, well, attendees are often addressing the mental health issue. Sometimes we support someone, and you have supportive staff during NATO missions. And Heidi, you raised the issue during our deployments. My experience personally is to the effect of saying that more often than not, we had no communication whatsoever with half of the Afghan population, which was comprised of women. Yes, some initiatives were born from the United States. Some Canadian initiatives also were implemented, whereby we trained some teams, notably initiatives for women, so that we could show the women's side of things with the NATO forces, but this was minimal, infinitesimal, and we took care more of the physical side of things, physical protection per se. We took care of that, but the whole mental, moral, psychological side of things was neglected. In Canada, people say there are a lot of post-traumatic syndrome events amongst the military. Mr. Roswell has alluded to that. And I always keep in mind the very idea that since 1979 in Afghanistan, people have been fighting, waging war there. If you're born after or before, after that date, so all you faced over there, it's a war. And so who takes care of the Afghan population regarding post-traumatic syndrome? Because some populations have only lived in a period of war during their whole life. So with the Kosovo experience, I was wondering, based on what has been said, anybody here, any attendee wanting to come up with an answer regarding what has been said? Maybe I may say more about it. Yes, Hani, I've lost my video function here, but anyway, I think you could see me.
The health and mental health support. I think the question was also what other plans NATO had, and you know, those two areas that were set up in Kosovo and in Poland, I think were never built to host refugees for a terribly extended period of time. Certainly not Afghan refugees. And I know that NATO's plan, with the help of allies, is to get those people patriated elsewhere as quickly as possible. Canada and this individual who asked the question were a big part of that in trying to get these folks out. As I mentioned, Canada took on almost 500 of those Afghans, brought them to Canada, and I know many other allies contributed. So there remains a small number of Afghans in these camps, and I know that we're all still working to try to find them new destinations. So that's what I can comment on. That's what I know, but I'm not sure about specific services that are being provided to them.
Merci. Je peux faire un petit bout de chemin sur votre commentaire, Hani.
I'll add something on your feedback, Hani. You've mentioned Canadian efforts so that we could welcome Afghan refugees here in Canada. So part of the process was about making sure they would exit Afghanistan, evacuation. So the other component is what happens when they are here. I'm sure that they're well treated here, but afterwards, how life would be for them. Access to school, maybe, access to leisure services. How's that happening? So the future of those people, they were repatriated, they were welcome in many different countries besides Canada, countries from NATO. So you may have an idea about what's happening elsewhere, perhaps, but that's the type of challenges that we have to face in view of this situation. Repatriating those Afghans, it's one part of the solution, maybe only. I have another question here from another participant. An attendee is mentioning the religious component here. This is interesting because Taliban's, before we got there, when we left, and when the resumed power, the seized power in August, so there is a religious innuendo that's part and parcel of their governance. And the attendee's question is about wondering, what about that? Was this something that we mentioned, that we raised in terms of religious considerations as pertains to the situation in Afghanistan? And we ask and request precisely something here. A moderate Islam with other moderate countries, a country like Turkey, for instance, as our attendee was mentioning here, could their participation have had a bearing on the current results? The religious component, this matter as part of our NATO strategy, was this raised? Was this entertained? And if yes, how has this been able to help out in view of the situation that we faced in August? Any speaker, any panel member wanting to risk something, risk an answer on that, the religious component regarding the strategy? I don't want to talk for too long here and seize this microphone, but no, go ahead.
In the last 5 years, as you mentioned, I was posted in Washington, where I covered, among other things, Asia, and we worked quite closely on a couple of crises happening there. One, the Rohingya, and two, the Uyghurs. And the Uyghur situation specifically solicited a similar type of question to the one that the participant just asked. Why not get moderate Muslim countries to support the idea, to support kind of this Western approach to things? And it's an absolutely excellent question. And I can say from experience that it's a question that is tried, and that the US and allies have tried to do. What ends up happening sometimes, and maybe it's just a China thing because China is so influential, is that even Muslim countries are not willing to necessarily take on a role in a conflict. Even public messaging may be a step too far for them. So there's been difficulty in generating these alliance, like a loose term of alliance outside of traditional alliances to come out strongly in support of one thing or another. I would assume, although I'm not an expert, it's something similar in Afghanistan, where there are other preoccupations from countries who don't necessarily want to be more involved than they currently are.
Merci beaucoup. Je vois que Chiara a la main levée.
Thank you. I see that Chiara has raised her hand. I just wanted to add something regarding this. This is related to the NATO countries that have participated in this Afghanistan mission. I have not necessarily understood the whole cultural and religious components, or maybe these things have not been fully understood. Just as an anecdote, just to evoke powerfully how misleading this was for many people. communication was there was a flaw. I met once with an officer from NATO's army, and so he came to Kabul. He came to the critical command point, and in 2008, he went to Kabul with a veil. You were wearing a veil, and he told me, Chiara, what are you doing? You're wearing a veil. Why are you wearing that? He had no idea what had happened outside of the headquarters and the base. He had no idea about what had happened there. But things were dangerous, so he had to be confined at the base. Okay, rightfully so, but he was not aware of what was happening beyond the base. The NATO forces, armed forces, have never really fully understood the religious considerations or the religious reality that would have been really important. It would have been really important or vital to understand these matters. Thank you. I think that Heidi has mentioned this. The out-of-zone situations can be approached sometimes in a totally westernized fashion. And it's a bit normal because NATO armed forces are born in a certain culture, most definitely. And when they get involved in Afghanistan or countries like that, these forces, as was mentioned, I mean, they were well prepared in a way, but we haven't covered all the topics, right? But minimally, at least, it took at least 10 months. So earlier, before getting there, lessons were learned, and culturally, religiously, about ways of living and so on. We had to come outside of our comfort zone because we had to go to a different country with a different culture, like Afghanistan, but to intervene there. Now, regarding the attendees' question, I remember that when we were deployed, I remember that some stories in the media were mentioning the fact that NATO is participating, they will get there, but what about other Muslim countries? Are they not going to participate in Afghanistan because it's a Muslim country? And so the matter has been considered and a question has been raised, and we may be entitled to ask the question indeed, but maybe that consideration because of NATO's culture, because of its standard or traditional fields of intervention or locations. This is something that was maybe hidden or forgotten. This is one of the lessons we can learn from that situation, definitely. There's another question from another attendee, and I think that what was quite surprising also, well, this morning, Mr. Delanoë was addressed well, in French, we talk about the outstanding or explosive role of, the explosiveness of the Kabul downfall, the downfall in Kabul, and the speed. This was lightning speed. This was a meteoric downfall. The Afghan government fell, and the Afghan armed forces who didn't surrender necessarily, but they didn't in turn react. And so the question is, so the Afghan people, if it was mandatory to join the armed forces in Afghanistan, wouldn't the armed forces from Afghanistan have been more operational? Maybe we have a colleague from the panel that would like to say something about that, because we haven't really talked about the whole omelette component, as we say, regarding NATO's contribution, the whole training that was provided to the Afghan army beyond conscription or enlistment. Does anybody want to say anything about that? Because the Afghan army was perceived as some type of base, some type of fulcrum that would be sustaining the reconstruction efforts of the remainder of the government. And so I have a personal idea about that because I saw that as it was deployed in terms of actions. Is there any panel member here that would want to say anything about that? Do you want to say anything about the role of NATO regarding the construction, the design of the Afghan army towards preparing and deploying the full elements that were necessary for the mandate to be carried out in Afghanistan? I may perhaps answer. There are words in French that I may not know necessarily. Why don't you speak English, Heidi? This is translated as we go. No, it's okay for me. This is a great opportunity for me because it's so much fun for me to speak French. It gives me so much joy to express myself in French, if it's okay. I think that NATO's role here, in view of designing the military force, this is a role that's played for future operations. And we have to think about the significance of oversight. Oversight, by that I mean accountability. There were all sorts of problems, issues, military, for instance, not just US military personnel or other armies also. I'm referring to armed forces from other countries. And military personnel, they learned that some people participated in the bribery and the corruption. They took actually some bribes, and for instance, and so this was a huge problem because the names of such soldiers were known because reports were available. But because of the names and the list, well, what I mean is that relations were too close for comfort, maybe. Friendship was born also between the trainers and the trainees who are Afghan soldiers. They thus didn't have any incentive to report people who were bribed or bribing. Anyway, there's the earlier issue that I've talked about. There are some reports that would be directed towards the chain of command, and because of that, because the non-reporting, some problems will occur eventually. And also the ghost soldiers, we've talked about that. This was well known. This was obvious. And so why was this not addressed by the armies and by, yes, the military? I think that one of the reasons why we've seen that the military or the Afghan armed forces, why have they collapsed so quickly? This was maybe also a problem. It wasn't just a low morale issue, but this was due also to a basic needs issue. Were soldiers paid? Were their basic needs met? Were they fed? What about their meals and their breakfast or their lunch? Did they get it on that same day, on a specific day, whatever? This was not always constant. These very basic and obvious things, as I said, were well known, but this is an issue that had not been solved. So there were no solutions for such issues. And I suppose that regarding future operations, this is something that was extremely important, because how is it possible to address moral issues or morale issue rather for regarding soldiers if they haven't been fed? Can't address their morale without addressing their lack of food. Indeed. Professor Paquin has a question. I'd like to give the floor to Professor Paquin. I'd like to mention something about how the Afghan army was created and built. And I mentioned that a lot of training occurred. The troops were drilled, were trained, and they also learned about history and cultural elements. But maybe civil war impact was deemed to be non-significant. before 2001. This was neglected as a topic, and they said we'll create an Afghan army. This will be a symbol of national unity, and will base on that effort to show people that there's unity. And then they realized that all of a sudden that Afghan people are comprised of Hazara, Tajik, Pashtun communities, and that their forefathers or great-fathers not so long ago were fighting each other during the Civil War. So they were former adversaries. So to take all these people from different ethnic groups and all of a sudden tell them you will be harmoniously linked in one unity initiative. Well, I have nothing against those very projects, but sometimes it takes time for wounds to heal. And I think that we wanted to proceed perhaps too fast. And just considering that component, the impact of the Civil War, and I'd like to give the floor to Jonathan Paquin. Chiara has raised her hand. Professor Paquin, Professor, go ahead. No, go ahead, Chiara. As we say in Quebec French, I am, je te lance la puck, I am giving you the hockey puck now. You can shoot and score. Okay, I'd like to add something. General and Professor Hardt, what you've said is interesting. I'd like to add something. Something that's important also was about how difficult it was to transfer military professionalism notions, which were Western notions, and how to pass them on so that this would be fully understood by an Afghan army so that they would get some ownership on those values. There was a debate about that, of the types of standards that were passed on onto the Afghan army. One of the standards that they preferred, they found, was the subordination rule for military. US Americans passed on a standard which is quite specific to the US Army. Again, can we insert that way? Can we pass it on as a value immediately to the Afghan army, this type of subordinate relationship to officials? Is it something that could be adopted easily? You know, that's how standards were passed on or conveyed, but things became more complicated than necessary. Perhaps we should have designed this better. Why should we transfer this? What's the top priority to be transferred or passed on to the Afghan troops? Thank you so much. In 8 minutes, we'll end this conference. I'd like to go back to the following component. One question here. Alexandre, if you want to say something, maybe about the Washington allies' reaction since the withdrawal or after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Days or weeks after the withdrawal, the Ukraine president has met with Biden and asked him for requested guarantees, making sure that they would support them if there's any issue, that they would support them. So the US quickly hacked withdrawal has created some issues. Strategically, the importance of increasing the internal balancing was also addressed because the very US reputation was damaged because things were done too precipitatiously. So in terms of alliances and so on, we've been talking and addressing all sorts of things. So in view of all that, how do you assess the situation after that perhaps too fast withdrawal from the US troops in Afghanistan?
I think there are not too many changes because the governments always act the same way. But what changes is the allies. So I think that the allies will respect their security engagements with their allies locally, and they're looking into what's happening elsewhere in the world. It's important because it gives us information. It gives us information about what the priorities and what the competencies of the Biden administration are. I think it's easy to exaggerate the consequences of this withdrawal. It is already the end of this conference. I'd like to get back to some elements that were raised throughout the panel since 9:30 this morning. 3 or 4 very brief elements. I know it's late, it's Friday afternoon. For us, it's Friday evening for some of our colleagues, including for Chiara, who has a bit less light today. Right now, it's the evening there. So, anyways, first of all the problems that were raised by Heidi about the implementation of the policies on the field in Afghanistan throughout all these years, and also, and this was mentioned by the Ambassador Roswell, that the NATO was probably not the right tool to deploy operations between 2003 and 2014, because that use raised legitimacy issues. And in his opinion, maybe another coalition that would have been less Western focused, including interests from Islamic states that would have been closer to Afghanistan, would have had more legitimacy in this operation. I hope that I interpreted his comments well. And also Heidi Hardt mentioned that NATO lacked strategy on the field, and as they were the tool used, there were failures, strategic failures, which partly explain the results we have seen on the field. Chiara mentioned quite clearly that it is probably the end of NATO's expeditionary operations on the short term, at least, maybe on the midterm as well, especially with the challenges NATO is facing with Ukraine. Notably, we can think that resources and energy will be focused on NATO's priority mission, which is to ensure the security and the peace of NATO partners and allies in Europe. So going back to the first panel of the day, Igor Delanoë showed us that Russia is reaffirming its influence in Central Asia, and that it is even exercising leadership in that several actors, including in Afghanistan, do not consider anymore that the main problem comes from Russia and the USSR. We remember the 80s, the war in the 80s, but that it is the Western countries that are the target of most criticism today. So Russia, without reinvesting in a significant way in Afghanistan, is reaping the benefits of this American withdrawal, and is probably taking advantage of this withdrawal to forward its interest on the Ukraine front. As to China, China is exercising greater influence in Afghanistan, including in the economic field, but also in the strategic field. This was mentioned by Niva Yao, and it is an advantage for China. But meanwhile, as Professor Ting Sheng Li mentioned, it is a two-bladed sword, because the Americans removed their beads from Afghanistan. It is that it gives them more leverage to focus on the India-Pacific region, because they are not involved in the Afghanistan conflict that is now peripheral to their strategic interests. So these are a few comments that I have for now. Of course, we always need a bit more time than the 6 or 7 hours that we have for this conference to digest information, where we receive a lot of information on behalf of our colleagues. I'd like to thank my co-organizer, Brigadier General Richard Giguère from the Institut Militaire de Québec, for this first partnership. I hope it's not the last. I also like to thank my research assistant, Jeanne Milo-Poulain, who did great work in the coordination of this event, and who was instrumental at a point because of the sanitary measures that evolved. And I'd like to thank the National Defense of Canada, particularly the MINDS project, that is funding the strategic analysis, the Network for Strategic Analysis. So thanks to the MINDS Scholarship Initiative from D&D, we are able to secure funding for this project. So there we go. Thank you. And keep posted for our next events. We will have several during 2022. I'd like to thank you, all of you, Chiara, Alexander, Hani, and Heidi, for this wonderful panel. It was very instructive. So I'm looking forward to seeing you in person. If this pandemic could end, it would be very interesting to see each other in person. So thank you. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Goodbye.
Au revoir.
Au revoir, merci beaucoup.
Au revoir, merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.